What was your experience with work? And somebody brought this up earlier with your healthcare providers when it comes to this. We're going to start off with Benita.
Yeah, so what was my experience with work? So there's two stories here. One was when I was a nurse, and then the second time was when I was in grad school. So the first time, I can't remember what the details were, but my maternity leave was cut short. I had planned on taking 12 weeks, and then I think it was something with my husband's job. I mean, he wasn't earning as much as he wanted to, so I went back to work early. And at the time, I was working in what we call the medical surgical float pool. So I was working at Abbott Northwestern Hospital in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the float pool is essentially a pool of workers that will go to units depending on where their healthcare needs are, what their staffing needs are. And so I felt like with me returning with the intention to pump and breastfeed, that I had to be extra assertive with what I needed to do to take my breaks. And so it was hard to advocate for myself, because while I knew most of the people, I had to remind people that I wanted to be able to step aside every 3 hours to be able to do so. And I found that I put the needs of my patients and the needs of my unit before my own needs. And it was not just for the purpose to pump, but it was also for the purpose to be in the moment and take a 15-minute break and nourish myself, to hydrate myself. I mean, some days I only, took one break to go to the bathroom quick. So I think as nurses, we often program ourselves to put other people's emotional and physical needs before ourselves. And I think that's also indoctrinated into people, specifically women, as they go through motherhood. So that was my experience with work. They did have like 2 pumping rooms for an organization that had over 1,000 nurses, I think. So it really wasn't realistic, because you would often try to go into the room and somebody else would be in it. So I either had to find an office that I could use or an empty patient room that was clean and pump in there. That's what it was. In grad school, I'll mention again that my daughter, I had every intention of having her bottle feed straight from the get-go, but she was not accepting anything. And so I would just pump to just relieve my breasts. And so my university that I was going to was actually very supportive. There was actually multiple lactation rooms for me to go to. My professors were aware of the situation. Hell, I even pumped in class. I mean, there was hundreds of us in class, and I don't care who was lecturing. I would just plug it into the side of the desk, commonly where people would plug in their laptops, and I would go at it. And so it was important to me, because she would not accept a bottle at any other way. And so I had to be able to provide nourishment for her, even though my intention was just to make it work for a few months and then let it be. I think that's what the support I had in terms of breastfeeding. But in terms of being a mother, and the support that I needed to be a mother and to be a working family member at work, it was a challenge, because even till this day, I think it's a lot more acceptable to take a sick day when your body is under the weather, if you have a viral syndrome, if you have a headache, whatever the physical complaint may be. But how often do we realistically admit to needing a mental health day? When you call into work, you have to essentially feel like you have to lie to take that mental health day off. And I still feel like that's the case. And so I think we need to kind of normalize that language that I need to have a mental health day. I think about what I counsel my patients on. And the story never is about me, but I do like to remind people that they do have some resources at work. And depending on who you're working for, some jobs do have employee assistance programs to where you can have some free counseling sessions available to you. And you'd have to look up your company policy if you're benefits eligible, but there's usually an X amount of services that are available to you that are no extra cost, even if you've already exceeded the amount that is available through your health insurance program. But the fact of the matter is, mental health is not where it should be right now. It's a long way for it to go in terms of what companies should be able to provide. Access to healthcare in general, there's not enough of it. And so there's also that. And I also want to comment probably a little later on some of the challenges that I'm working to address right now as it pertains to access to mental health care, how we address mental health care for communities of color, and how we address healthcare to people who are not, who are gender nonconforming and transgender. And so that is probably a little bit of a tangent off of this, but that's something I'm very passionate to talk about.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I think part of the question too was about your own healthcare experience. I know Celine mentioned about some of her experience, but if you wanted to add anything about that as well.
Yeah, so my own healthcare experience, I was very fortunate to have two wonderful midwives that I worked with. I made it a point to bring my husband to my prenatal appointments with our first pregnancy, and he also wanted to come to my postpartum appointments. And so it was very intentional that when my midwife saw myself at the 6-week postpartum workup, she said that if you're noticing X, Y, and Z in your partner, I want you to be able to follow up on this. And it was directed towards him. So in that way, she not only treated me, but she treated my husband as well. And she counseled on him on how to identify particular concerns. She was not the one that I followed up with for healthcare support. I followed up with my primary care provider with regards to treatment for postpartum depression and anxiety. And so at the time, my desire was to get on an antidepressant that I could still breastfeed with. And at the time, it was sertraline, fluoxetine, otherwise known as Prozac, and Paxil, otherwise known as paroxetine. And so I did go with one of those options. I already had experience with two, which were the Zoloft and the Prozac. And so I did choose Paxil, which is much better geared towards anxiety. And I did surprisingly feel that it worked well. It worked very, very well for me. And it didn't have the side effects that I anticipated that it would. And so in my second pregnancy with my daughter, Simone, my midwives were very intentional about checking in on my anxiety and depression. During my pregnancy, they also referred me preemptively to the perinatal mental health program with Swedish Health Services. And so I was already linked into some wraparound services should I have needed it postpartum. And so it was a much different experience than my first pregnancy. And so overall, despite some things that had changed for me, situationally speaking, I had a much better support system the second time around as it pertained to my healthcare.
All right, let's go to Celine.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to respond to something, Tony, that you said earlier about kind of that dynamic between you and Guinevere when you were trying, to offer the formula and trying to do something to give her a break. I'm only speaking to my own experience, but for me, I had said in my past moments here that for me, breastfeeding wasn't a choice. And I strongly believe that for me, that had a lot to do with my postpartum anxiety that I was experiencing. Guinevere, you had touched briefly on saying like, you felt like if things weren't done a certain way, you know, it was really upsetting to you. And I would take it a step further in my own experience and say that for certain things, even to this day with my children, my brain tells me that this is going to sound dramatic. My brain tells me I'm killing them, you know? So for me, that's how breastfeeding was and is for me. I'm actually still breastfeeding my son. He's a year and a half, where if he needs that and wants that from me and I'm not able to give it to him or don't give it to him, I have this anxiety surrounding it. And I just wanted to bring it back to that and say, you know, for some people, it might not necessarily be rational, but it's again rooted in that mental illness. Touching on, I know I talked briefly about my experience in the medical system. What I didn't clarify is who I was receiving care from. So I was actually lucky enough as well to be seeing a midwife group in a hospital setting. There were 3 midwives that I was working with, and I worked with them for both of my pregnancies. And with my second pregnancy, a lot of factors coincided at the same time immediately postpartum for me. One is that my insurance changed not long after I had a baby due to my age. The second is that the hospital that is my primary care for my children, our whole family always has been, and is in my hometown, cut the midwife program completely. Said that they were no longer needed, and that there was even some slander in the community regarding the safety of a midwife. And these were hospital midwives, mind you, not home birth midwives. So the training is, you know, almost identical as far as what they're receiving to the OBs. So it was not, I think it was a week or 2 after my 6-week postpartum appointment that they were completely cut. They luckily are still in the area, and they're practicing with a different organization now, which is great. I still keep in touch with them. But the midwife that I was seeing at my 6-week postpartum appointment was literally losing her job in 7 days. So all she could do was refer me out. So then when I was referred out, like I said, I saw a non-specializing psychiatrist, was prescribed things that I didn't end up taking, et cetera, et cetera. As far as my experience returning to work, again, there were multiple factors in play at that moment for me. Actually, my maternity week was the solid 12, or my maternity leave was the full solid 12 weeks. And I came back a week and a half early to interview for a promotion. And I rocked out the interview. I got the position. I started back to work. And I was in a leadership role within my company. I worked for a bank, worked for a different bank at the time, that really wasn't offered to people of my age. So I was, I had all this pressure, but then what it led to is I came back to work when my son was barely 3 months old, and all of a sudden I'm flying to Chicago every 2 weeks. I'm going to these big training events. I'm running my own branch. I moved from hourly to salary, which is the craziest jump, because you think it means you're going to be making a lot more money, but all it means is that you're working a lot more hours and you're making probably less than you were before. And suddenly I'm working like 60 to 70 hour weeks. I'm traveling all the time for work. I'm having to pump in an airport. And because of the transition I was going through career-wise at that time, the transition back to work was way overwhelming. And I'm honestly like a little embarrassed to say this, because as far as I don't know who's going to end up listening to this that I know personally, but there's not a whole lot of people that know how big of a part of my decision career-wise this played. But I ended up actually switching back to an old company that I used to work for and taking a demotion. I actually requested a demotion. There wasn't a comparable position available in my company. So I went back to a company I'd worked for previously, went back to hourly, still in a leadership role, but definitely not at the level that I was. And I have a lot of shame surrounding it, honestly, because I feel like it wasn't choosing motherhood over career. It was literally, I can't juggle what I have on my plate and something is going to give. And I feel like I failed. So for career-wise and the transition back into it, for me, it's still a pain point because I'm now in, someone told me if you ever take a step back in your career, you'll never recover from it. You'll never learn how to go forward again. And I did it because my back was against the wall. And every single day I wake up and I wonder if that is true for me. So, and it has everything to do with what I was going through postpartum.
It's not true. The taking the step back on the career thing, it's just not true. So part of my whatchamacallit, I made a huge mistake at work. I lost my job. I got fired on the next one. I was a mess. It was 100% of a mess, right? So like, that's the equivalent of like your demotion is like probably what I would say. And it took me about a year and a half and I'm back and better than from when I started. Absolutely. It's a slow move back, but you will get there. Absolutely. That kind of thing, it's that mindset is what will keep you there.